going to be exciting. Very well. Well, let's get started. Welcome, everyone, all you courageous souls that are here just a few days before the break. That speaks highly of all of you. Of course, Lisa Barrett's reputation precedes her, so we know that we're here for a great hour and a half. By the way, we will be having the presentation, and then we'll have about half an hour of questions. So be thinking about what you might want to ask and say. Let me also, before introducing our dear colleague, let you know that this is the third of a total of 4 lectures that we are sponsoring this year. I am Jose Buscaglia, the director of the Center for International Affairs and World Cultures, and our yearly lecture series this year is entitled Us versus Them, going beyond the biology of otherness. And the last lecture of the semester of the academic year will be on March the 20th by our own colleague Maya Cross, and it'll be entitled The Ultra-Social World, International Cooperation Against All Odds. So we hope to see most of you, if not all of you, here on March the 20th. Today, of course, we're here for Lisa Barrett's talk entitled Emotions, Separating Fact from Fiction. Dr. Barrett's research focuses on the nature of emotion from the perspective of both psychology and neuroscience, and takes inspiration from anthropology, philosophy, and linguistics. Her lab takes an interdisciplinary approach and incorporates methods from social, clinical, and personality psychology, psychophysiology, cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience, and visual cognition. Her current projects focus on understanding the psychological construction of emotion and age and disease-related changes in affective circuitry within the human brain, how language and context influence emotion perception, how affect influences vision, and sex differences in emotion. So without further ado, I will leave you with Dr. Barrett and her talk, Emotions Separating Fact from Fiction.
Thank you very much.
Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I should give an extra thanks to those of you who come to a talk at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a very cold Wednesday. So hopefully what I'll say today will be entertaining enough that it will be worth your while. As many of you know, there are lots of examples of fictions in science. We used to believe that the sun revolved around the Earth. We used to believe that the Earth was flat. In the science of emotion, we now have our own set of fictions as well. These are common sense beliefs about emotion. For the example is the movie Inside Out. Supposedly we have little characters that live in our brains, one for joy, sadness, disgust, one for fear, one for anger. And this movie was made in the US, where we have 500 best-selling books on how to be happy. So of course joy was the leader in this movie. But after 25 years of doing research in my own lab and reading literally thousands of research papers from other labs, I can tell you that emotions are not what most people think they are. And in fact, there are 3 central fictions that turn out to be actually, you can think of them as our most cherished beliefs about emotion that we're going to dispel today. And if there's time, depending on how much time there is, we'll talk about what is actually going on under the hood in your brain when you experience emotion or perceive emotion in someone else. And we'll talk a little bit, this talk is not really organized around cultural differences or the ways that biology can trip us up in cross-cultural interactions or even interactions with people who are just somewhat different from us, but I think it'll become clear how that's the case later on in the talk, if there's time. So let's have a go at these 3 fictions. The first is that emotions are displayed on the face with recognizable expressions. People are supposed to smile when they're happy. They're supposed to frown when they're sad. They're supposed to scowl when they're angry. Everyone around the world is supposed to make these expressions when they are in these emotional states, and we're supposed to recognize scowls and frowns and smiles as expressions of emotion. So consider the evidence. Along the horizontal axis here, I'm going to display for you the facial configurations that are assumed to be the universal expressions of 6 of the most popular emotion categories. Can you, well, actually, we don't have time for you to guess what they are. We'll save the interaction for later. And then along the y-axis here, I'm presenting the proportions of times that we see people make these faces, scowls and sneers and smiles and so on, in the during the emotional events that they're supposed to occur in. So in one recent meta-analysis that was published, and this is just a statistical summary of existing studies, where we are looking at how often do people actually make these faces. So how often do people make a wide-eyed, gasping face when they're fearful? How often do they pout or frown when they're sad? How often do they smile when they're happy? How often do they scowl when they're angry or wrinkle their nose when they're disgusted? The answer is not very frequently. So the N here is the sample size, the number of studies that are available to be meta-analytically summarized. And you can see that there aren't that many. Because actually the majority of studies that speak to the question of facial expressions and emotion are perception studies, or how one person makes sense of another person's face. Production studies, studies where we actually measure how people move their faces during emotional events, are actually quite rare in the literature, because it's actually really hard to do. It's actually much easier to do now with new technology, but in the past it was very difficult to do. And so the thing to notice here, for example, let's take a nose wrinkle in disgust. People on average make that face in episodes where they're disgusted about 30% of the time, which is more than what you would expect by chance. But it's not nearly as high as what you would expect if it was a universal. So these facial movements aren't random, but they're also not universal. Let's compare this, though, to how often perceivers, like you and I, make judgments of these faces as the hypothesized emotion. So even though people only make a nose wrinkle in disgust about 30% of the time, 32% of the time, 77% of the time, people they identify a nose wrinkled face, a face with a nose wrinkle, as an expression of disgust. Now these are also meta-analytic summaries, and they're summaries based on studies that were done cross-culturally, so across a range of cultures, but all kind of large urban cultures, cultural settings where people have access to knowledge about the practices and norms and values of Western civilizations. These numbers drop precipitously when you look to rural or remote cultures, particularly if they don't have access to Western cultural practices and norms. So for example, this is a graph or a figure that I took from a recent paper that I worked on with a number of my colleagues, where we've summarized every single study that's been published or is in press, looking at how people from different cultures, remote cultures, cultures where they don't really have access to, in any kind of consistent way, to Western cultural practices and norms. So for example, you can see these two studies were done on the Hadza of Tanzania. These are individuals who live in Tanzania who are hunter-gatherers. They've their culture has been hunting and gathering since the Pleistocene. They're not an ancient culture, right? They're modern humans just like you and me. But they have some of the oldest mitochondrial DNA on the planet, and they live in a cultural context which is very similar to our ancestors during on the African savannah, and they don't perceive emotional expressions in any way that is even remotely similar to the way that we do it. So for them, a scowl is not necessarily anger, a nose wrinkle is not necessarily disgust, and in fact, some of these, the words for these emotion categories don't even actually exist in their native Hadzane language. They exist in Swahili, which is the second language that they speak. So there's really very little evidence that that we can read each other's faces the way we read words on a page. And if I were to take hundreds of studies and sum them up for you, the summary would go something like this. When you look at this person's face, most people see her from a large urban Western cultural context, see her as sad or as grieving or as maybe tired. But actually, this is my daughter, Sophia, experiencing only what I can describe to you as a profound sense of pleasure. She's on her second chocolate drink. This is at the Cologne Chocolate Museum in Cologne, Germany. This little sweetheart is also experiencing a profound sense of pleasure. And the lesson here is that people move their faces in many different ways during instances of the same emotion category. Now, when we just look at this little guy's eyebrow region, he's actually arching his brows in a way that is very similar to the hypothesized expression for anger. And in fact, when people look at this guy, they see him as furious, really, just enraged. But this actually is Jim Webb. Does anyone know who Jim Webb is? Yes, Jim Webb, for those of you who don't know, in 2006, won the senatorial race in Virginia that returned the Senate to Democratic control. Only in Massachusetts can I say, I want you to just imagine what that would be like for a minute. It doesn't work in other parts of the country, but here, I know you're with me on this one. So without context, his face looks like he is communicating anger because, in fact, this is the face that symbolizes anger in our culture. So the lesson here is that people not only move their faces in different ways during instances of the same emotion category, they also move their faces in exactly the same way in instances of different emotion categories. A face does not speak for itself when it comes to emotion. When you see another person, your brain is actually guessing, inferring what those facial movements mean. And this is occurring very automatically with very little effort on your part. Even people who believe that they read other people well, who have confidence that they are great at reading people, are also just guessing. Their brains are just guessing under the hood. And these guesses actually come from your past experience. So people who come from very different cultural backgrounds are just set up to misinterpret each other's facial movements. Under the hood, these guesses that are happening really automatically are making meaning of the raise of an eyebrow or the curl of a lip or the tilt of a head in a particular context or situation. And this is how a single physical feature like a smile can take on very different emotional meanings in different contexts. So when it comes to emotion, variation is the norm. And when I say variation, I'm not talking about random movements here. I'm talking about situated movements. That is, your brain is creating emotion or perceiving emotion in a way that is really tied to the situation. And if the situations that you experience in your past are very different from someone else's, then the storehouse of knowledge that you have to make sense of other people's movements or even make sense of your own body, as we'll see, it can be very different. So what's up with these expressions, which, from a common sense standpoint, people believe are universal? In fact, there are in industry and in government, people are spending literally billions of dollars on the assumption that these are the universal expressions. Actually, the government, our government, spent $900 million to train TSA agents to identify. Yeah, I know. There were congressional hearings, which you probably didn't hear about, but there were. Yeah. And the funny thing is, the science, it's not like this is news. These scientific findings have been around for a really long time. Not the Hadza findings, which I just mentioned to you. Those are brand new from my lab, actually. But this evidence has been around for a really long time. It turns out that these faces were not discovered by observing how people express emotions in their everyday lives. They were stipulated by a handful of scientists who adopted them as a universal truth and then built a science around them. So really, they're basically Western stereotypes. Actually, they're American stereotypes. And, well, they're British stereotypes too. So they're stereotypes that really took hold in the mid-19th century with Charles Darwin, actually. So what we really have is a science of emojis when it comes to facial expressions. What about the body? The second myth or fiction that we'll talk about today is the idea that each emotion comes with its own signature of physical changes in the body. So oftentimes psychologists and neuroscientists will refer to the great William James, who is considered to be the father of American psychology, as having said that every emotion has its own pattern of changes associated with the autonomic nervous system. So in anger, your blood pressure is supposed to go up. In fear, your heart rate goes up, and so on and so forth. Well, it turns out that William James actually didn't say that. In fact, William James said exactly the opposite. William James said every instance of emotion has its own bodily pattern. What he said was every instance of anger that you have that feels different has its own bodily pattern. Sometimes your blood pressure will go up. Sometimes it will go down. Sometimes think about all the things that you do in anger or that you see people do in anger. I don't know about you, but sometimes I, stomp my foot in anger. Actually, when my car got stuck in my driveway in the ice storm, I had a serious moment of foot stamping in anger. Because, I'm Canadian and it's embarrassing to have your car stuck in the ice in your own driveway. So I had a real tantrum, a full-on stereotypic anger, but there are other times when I laugh in anger. I sometimes cry in anger. I sometimes sit silently and seethe and plan the demise of my enemies in anger, right? I do lots of things in anger. I'm sure you do too. And that means your body does different things in anger as well. And that's actually what William James said. And that's actually what the data show. So here's another meta-analysis. This one is from my lab. What we did is we statistically summarized over 200 studies where we looked at physical changes that occur during episodes of emotion. So on the y-axis here are the different physical changes that can be measured. And then on the x-axis here, we're presenting the average effect size, which is what is the average size of change that you see, and the magnitude, it's presented here as a correlation coefficient. But basically, the bigger the value, the more the change you see in that emotion during episodes of that emotion. So here are the effect sizes for episodes of neutral experience where people are they're not happy, they're not sad, they're not afraid, they're just in a neutral state. And the size of the shape indicates something about the number of studies that were available for summaries, right? So for example, there were many more studies of measuring people in a neutral state, many more studies that measured heart rate than measured something like let's say, respiration rate, how quickly people were breathing. And the bars there represent the 95% confidence interval. So that's the range of values which are not statistically different from the shape, where the shape is, the value of the shape. And so if different emotion categories have their own characteristic pattern of autonomic nervous system changes, we should see that the shapes don't overlap, nor do their bars overlap, nor do the wings overlap. And so here's what we see. These are the effect sizes for anger, for fear, for disgust, for sadness, for happiness. There are no unique patterns of physical changes for any emotion that has ever been measured. It doesn't matter how you analyze the data. It doesn't matter what you control for. You can control for where the study was run, who the study was run with, how was emotion induced. None of it changes this pattern, basically. So, and even when we do very sophisticated statistical analyses like machine learning, we don't actually see distinct physiological patterns. What this means is that emotions are not written into your body. They are actually constructed by your brain. What your brain is doing is it's making physiological changes meaningful to you as emotion. So think about all of the things that can make you happy in your life. Maybe it's going for a walk in the woods. Maybe it's lying on a bucolic beach somewhere. Maybe it's baking a chocolate cake for your friends or your family. Maybe it's doing a yoga class. Maybe it's gossiping with your friends over coffee. Maybe it's gardening. In each of these cases, you will be happy. And in each of these cases, your body, the state of your body will be different. Your heart rate will be different. Your blood pressure will be different. Your skin conductance, which is electrical measurement of electrical conductivity across your skin, will be different, which is an indication of how much you're sweating, and so on and so forth. Since the 1970s, it's been known pretty clearly by physiologists that the state of your body tracks your physical movements or the movements that your brain is preparing you to make. And so if you move differently in different emotions, in different instances of the same emotion, then your body will be doing something different in those emotions. And that's exactly what we see, right? So the point here is that a change in blood pressure or a change in heart rate in and of itself is not emotional. There's no physical change in your body that inherently is emotional. Your brain makes it emotional by giving it meaning as an emotion. Because emotions are actually not your reactions to the world. They are your constructions of the world. Precisely, they are your brain's understanding of what is going on inside your own body in relation to what is happening in the world. You can think about what's happening in the world, what's happening in your own body as ingredients that your brain is using to make sense and to plan what your next action will be and what your experience will be. And this is all happening under the hood very quickly. In fact, it takes me longer to say it than it actually does to happen in your brain. So this is how an ache in your gut can be, in one situation, can be turned into hunger. In another situation, it can be turned into longing or anxiety. And in another situation, it can be a feeling of distrust. For example, if you are a judge or a jurist in a courtroom. So your brain is taking its past knowledge and what's going on inside your own body and what's going on in the world, and it's basically constructing meaning. And sometimes that meaning is an emotion. Now, the third myth or fiction that we're going to deal with today is the idea that there are dedicated circuits for emotion in your brain. So emotions feel like they happen to us, taking us over, causing us to act in ways or sometimes say things that we'd rather that we hadn't. And this makes us believe that emotions come kind of baked into some kind of inner beast that's kind of pre-wired into some sort of ancient part of our brains. But that's actually not true. our experiences of emotion don't reveal to us the inner workings of the brain. And there is actually no part of your brain that is emotional, that is dedicated to emotion, nor is there any part of your brain that's dedicated to thinking or rationality. That's just a Western myth. So the example I'm going to use with you today is the famous amygdala, which here I've outlined in red. So for those of you who aren't familiar with brain images, I will tell you that this is what we call in neuroscience a coronal slice of the brain. So if I were to slice my brain this way, which many of my colleagues who don't agree with me would love to see me do, slice this way, and pop open my face, if I were looking in the mirror, this is what we'd see. I mean, it would be more bloody, obviously, but that's what we would see. And we have two amygdala, this is actually the right, and this is the left, because this is it's actually the way these images work are flipped, but that doesn't really matter for today's purposes. The point is that this is a very famous. Who here has heard of the amygdala before? Yeah, this is like the rock star of a brain region because it shows up in all the news stories. Journalists like to write about it. This is supposed to contain the brain circuit for fear. And so again, in my lab, we tested these claims, not only by running individual experiments, but also by doing a meta-analysis where we summarized hundreds of studies statistically. And so here what I'm going to show you are the proportion of studies that report of emotion that report an increase in amygdala activity. So subjects are in the brain scanner, lying in the brain scanner, we're scanning their brains and they're experiencing emotion, and then we can measure their brain activity. And so in about 30% of those studies, we do see an increase in amygdala activity that's greater than what you would expect by chance. So that's good. That means sometimes when people are feeling afraid, they have an increase in amygdala activity. But not most of the time, not even much of the time, just sometimes. And actually, it turns out that that's true of every emotion that's ever been studied. And actually, there are many cases where people are not even experiencing emotion, and we see an increase in amygdala activity. In fact, if I were to take you and show you novel faces, actually novel anything, anything that you haven't seen before, a scene, a word, anything that is novel to you, I would see huge changes in amygdala activity. Because what the amygdala is doing really, well, the amygdala is not really one structure. It's actually a bunch of clumps of cells working together. But if we were to say it had one job, its job would be to alert the rest of the brain that something is unknown, uncertain, or novel, and the rest of the brain has to learn about it so that information will be then available in your brain to use at a later date. So if something is happening and it's important to your survival, or the brain just doesn't even know whether, it might be, it might not be, it's just uncertain, the amygdala will care, your amygdala will care, and it will alert the rest of your brain to learn what is about to happen so that you can have that information to use it later. That's basically what the amygdala does. And this finding that we see that there's no, the amygdala is not specific, doesn't specifically hold the circuitry for fear, this is true for every brain region that's ever been studied as the location of emotion. If we were to do fancy machine learning to try to locate patterns across the brain, we would see something very similar, actually. So, for example, we can take the meta-analysis, the database, and we can, so we would have one pattern of brain activity for every study, whether people are one study where people are experiencing anger, and another for another study where people are experiencing fear, and so on and so forth. And we can do something called pattern classification, where we can take all of the studies except one, which we leave out. We take all the studies and we try to find the patterns that best diagnose the state of anger or disgust or fear and so on. And then we try to classify the one pattern that we left out. By looking at the brain activity, were subjects angry, or were they disgusted, or were they fearful, or were they happy, and so on and so forth. And we can just do this over and over and over again. We can come up with these patterns. And so when people look at these patterns, these patterns allow us to look at brain activity in a study and guess better than chance what the person was feeling. And so people look at these and they go, okay, well, that red pattern, that's the pattern for anger in your brain, or that green pattern, that's the pattern for disgust in your brain. You hear about people using machine learning techniques, like this is got a fancy name called multivoxel pattern analysis. And the idea is that this is somehow like a mind reading technique where we can look into your brain and know exactly what you're seeing, thinking, feeling just by looking at the pattern. Except that's wrong. These patterns are statistical summaries. They aren't brain states. So if I were to image your brain while you're experiencing anger, it could look nothing like that red pattern. But as long as your pattern is closer to the red pattern than it is to any other patterns, I'll be able to diagnose you as being angry. Even if not a single point of activity is the same in your brain and in that red pattern. The analogy here would be, on average, in the United States, a middle-class family has 3.13 children. No family, though, as far as I know, have 3.13 children. Actually, it's not 3.13 children, 3.13 people in a middle-class American family. No family has 3.13 people in it. That's a statistical average. This is a statistical average. Okay? And it turns out that these averages, these patterns, don't replicate. There are now 5 or 6 different studies that put people in various emotional states, measure their brains, come up with patterns. The patterns look nothing alike. That's not a bug. That's a feature. That doesn't mean the science isn't working. In this case, it means the hypothesis is wrong. Just like we saw with the face, just like we saw with the body, just like we see with the voice and with every other measure that we can take about emotion, variability is the norm. And this is actually very, very consistent. How this works is very, very consistent with what Darwin taught us about how biological categories work. So in the interest of time, I was going to talk to you about some twins. I'm just going to skip this part, actually. It's basically two sisters, monozygotic twins. They both have amygdala lesions. One has so this is I guess I'm not skipping it. This is an axial view. So if you look at the brain this way and you pop the top off, you look down, that's what you're seeing. The front of the brain is at the top there. And the colors are where their amygdalas used to be. So these twins who share 100% of their genetic material both have amygdala lesions. The one on the left, BG, has fear-related deficits. She has trouble experiencing, and she can experience fear and perceive fear in very restricted circumstances, but she also has some deficits. But her sister, who has exactly the same genetic material as her and no amygdala, has no problems at all. Why? Because the way biological categories work, there's more than one mechanism usually to get to the function that, just like your immune system, right? There's more than one match between an antibody and an antigen, a virus or whatever. And similarly here, there's more than one way to make anger in a brain. There's more than one way to make sadness in the brain. That's why different studies find different patterns. So emotions are complex constructions that your brain makes. They're not simple circuits. You do not have these ancient emotion circuits buried deep inside some animalistic part of your brain, even if it feels that way sometimes to us. But our feelings how we experience emotions are not a guide to how our brains make emotion. And as I was saying before, the brain is not a battleground between reason and emotion. This has been a recurring belief really since ancient Greece that neuroscientists just kind of tattooed onto the brain. There are no parts of your brain for emotion. There are no parts of your brain for cognition. Reason doesn't rule emotion, right? They don't live in separate parts of the brain. That is a Western myth, basically. And I point out that it's a Western myth because for half the population of this world, emotions and cognition, thoughts and feelings aren't even separate. That's just a very Western contrivance for the way that we understand morality in Western societies. So what do we know, actually? What I'm going to do now is just give you some touchstones for things that we know. There's really no way that I could explain this to you in the 10 minutes. Even if I had an hour, I couldn't do it. But I'm just going to give you sort of some of the highlights. Emotions are not built into your brains. They're built by your brain as you need them in a very specific, situated way. So your emotions are not your reactions to anything. Your brain makes them in concert with information from your body and from the world. So an emotion is an event where your whole brain is making meaning out of internal sensations in terms of what is going on around you in the world. An emotion is your brain's understanding of what's going on inside your own body in relation to the context so that it can figure out what you need to do next to keep you alive and well. So emotions, it's not like you encounter a situation, evaluate what it means, which is called an appraisal, react to it, and then that's your emotion. Emotions are what situations mean in an embodied way. And to see how this works, we're actually going to take the perspective of your brain and your brain's major challenge, which is what we call the reverse inference problem. For your entire life, your brain is trapped inside a dark, silent box called your skull. And it has to learn what is going on in the outside world only indirectly through the information that it gets from its sensors, right? Your eyes, your ears, and so on and so forth. So the sensory changes that it receives are the effects of something that happened in the world that it doesn't have access to. It only has access to the effects, and it has to guess at what the causes are. Any given flash of light could have multiple causes. So how does your brain know? Or any given change in air pressure, how does your brain know whether that honk is a horn or a duck or someone laughing? The answer is it has to infer that. Similarly, how does your brain know whether a given ache or a shiver is what the cause is? How does it know? The answer is it has to guess. It has to infer. So this is what we call a reverse inference problem because your brain is receiving sensations and it has to guess at the causes. And where does the information come from? The guess that your brain is continually making. And the answer is it comes from your past experiences. Your brain doesn't retrieve past experiences. It makes them, it re-implements them in the way that the neurons talk to each other and pass information back and forth. And what your brain is doing is it's basically remembering past experiences that are similar to the current situation in some way. So it's asking itself, not what are these sights and sounds and smells and aches. It's asking, what are these like? What are these similar to in my past experience? The last time I experienced this set of sights and sounds and smells and aches in this situation, what happened next? That's what your brain is doing. And in psychology, so your brain is conjuring a bunch of representations that have some probability of being similar to the current situation. And in psychology, a group of things which are similar in some way is a category. And a mental representation of a category is a concept. So your brain is basically making concepts. Basically making concepts to guess at the meaning of the sensations that it only has access. It only has access to the effects of the sensations, the effects, and it has to guess at the causes, and it does that by making concepts. And it's doing this on the fly, continually changing the concepts it makes based on the situation, which are called ad hoc concepts. So it's reinstating patterns of past experiences that are similar to the present conditions as a way of making sense of the current sensory conditions so that it knows what to do next. It's making ad hoc concepts based on your past experience. So if you and I have very different past experiences, that is an opportunity for miscommunication. If we have very similar experiences, that's an opportunity for communication. The really cool thing about the brain, though, is that it can actually combine past experiences in novel ways, which we call conceptual combination. So if you've never had a pizza before, and I say the word pizza to you, and you've never seen a pizza, you don't know what a pizza is, I say the word pizza, that means nothing to you. I say the word pizza, I have a bunch of features in my head that I'm thinking about. It's round, it has tomato sauce, it has cheese on it. Maybe if you're from some part of Italy, there's no tomato sauce, maybe another part there is. If you're from Chicago, it's deep, and if that's not really pizza, we know, but still, they call it pizza, so I hope I didn't offend anybody here. But if you don't know the word pizza, you've never had a pizza, I say the word pizza, that single word is not communicating to you. I'm not conjuring in your head all of those features. In fact, I'm conjuring none. But if I tell you, well, it's bread, and it's round, and it has tomato sauce on it, and it's got melted cheese, kind of like and I sort of explain it to you feature by feature, then your brain can put it together, and you can sort of make a reasonable guess at what a pizza is, even if you've never seen it, never tasted it, never encountered it before. This is one of the superpowers of the human brain. We can do conceptual combination as some scientists think of it as the most powerful thing that we can do, actually. And the other really cool thing is that we do it predictively. So your brain isn't waiting to encounter sensations. It's taking and then guess at them. What it's doing is it's taking exactly the situation if we could sort of freeze time, your brain would be taking the situation exactly as it is right now, the state of your body, the state of the world. And it's asking, the last time I was in this state, what happened next? Or the last time I was in a state that was similar to this, in a similar situation, what happened next? It's basically using the present conditions as a way of guessing what the sensations are going to be in the next moment. And those guesses are its bid to explain those sensations which it's anticipating. So it's all happening predictively. Once upon a time, in a magical kingdom, far, far away, there lived a beautiful princess. How did you know? Because the concepts that you need to make sense of those shapes and the sounds of my voice aren't stored in your head. They're made in advance. And that's how you could guess that I would say princess, and that I didn't say, you'd be surprised if I had said, an orangutan or a car. You might not have been surprised if I'd said a king these days, or if you're watching a Monty Python skit. So it turns out that brains are not wired for reaction. They're actually wired for prediction. And we know this actually by looking at the structure of brains and also looking at the metabolic cost of a brain and also the electrical wiring and functioning of a brain. making ad hoc concepts to guide your actions and predictively create your experiences is actually the cheapest, most efficient way to regulate your brain. And in fact, that efficiency, that metabolic efficiency, is a key constraint on brain function and your health. And, you know, if this were a different talk about the biology of otherness, we would be talking about why it is that nationalism and all sorts of prejudices just bubble to the surface in conditions where people are living where their bodies are in conditions where they're not being metabolically efficient, basically. The way to think about it is that your brain evolved to run a budget for your body. Your brain didn't evolve to see or think or feel or hear. It evolved to regulate your body. And it has to do it in a very efficient way. It's got to have a good balance. Okay, so instead of budgeting money, it's budgeting like glucose and water and salt and oxygen. And just like any really good bank account, right, your brain is going to manage those things efficiently by doing it predictively. If you're going to have a big expenditure, you don't spend it and then be in the deficit position and then replenish, right, and then make a deposit. No, you move money around so that the money's there. So in a similar way, if your brain is going to stand you up, it's going to raise your blood pressure before it stands you up so that oxygen can get to your brain so that you don't faint, because fainting is very metabolically costly. And actually, this is how your brain works. So what happens when your brain is running a deficit? When you're stressed, that's what it means to be stressed. When you don't have enough money in your actual real bank account, or when you're on social media too much, or when you don't get enough sleep, or when you don't exercise efficiently, or when you're eating pseudo food instead of eating real food. What happens when you add all those things together? You have a body budget that is in the red. And what do you do when your budget is in the red? When you're running a deficit in your real budget, in your real bank account, what do? You stop spending. What does the brain do? It tries to cut costs. How does it cut costs? Well, you feel tired. Moving is expensive, moving your body. What else does it do? Well, it stops learning. It stops paying attention to differences. It stops learning new things that it didn't anticipate, because learning new things is actually really expensive. And it seeks out things it can predict, things that it knows, things that are familiar, things that don't require any surprise, that don't require any learning, that don't require any serious investment of resources to, right? And that means interacting with people who are just like you. So there's a reason why people are curating their own news and focusing on, like-minded people, because it's metabolically cheaper. So that's a whole other talk that we could have here. But the point is that these are the kinds of things that are really not that well known about brain function, but in the general public, but have actually been known by neuroscientists for quite some time now. So the other really cool thing about these ad hoc concepts is that they are not abstract. Okay, how many of you have actually seen an electrical tower jump like this before in real life? But your brain can make an ad hoc concept. And how many of you can hear that, the thud? And how many of you can feel it, actually? Feel it. Okay, but there is no actual jumping, right? So it's because when your brain makes a concept, it's not just some abstract thing that it's doing. Remember, it's anticipating the sights and sounds and smells that are about to happen. It's actually changing the firing of its own neurons. Your brain changes the firing of its own sensory neurons. So you can anticipate and make sense of information that you've never encountered before. Why do you feel the thud? because your brain, in making a concept to understand this image, is actually changing the firing of its own somatosensory neurons. And then you feel a thud, even though there is no thud. How many of you have ever heard a song go through your head that you can't get out of your head? Oh, seriously? Come on. I know it's late, but seriously, I mean, yeah. Why? Because your brain is changing the firing of its own auditory neurons so that you can hear something that actually isn't there. Now, this is a contrived example, but it's a contrived example to make a point that this is actually how your brain works under the hood in ways that you can't experience in your everyday life. But this is actually what's happening. So I'm going to wrap up. If I could find, I'm trying to skip through some slides so we can wrap up, but I actually can't find my cursor. Oh, there it is. Okay. I've just given you a bit of a taste of how your brain is working and the way that these processes might be involved in creating emotions. In fact, it turns out this is really what your brain is doing to create every mental event, to create every experience that you have, to guide every action that you take. If you would like to know more about this, you can have a look at my book, which is available on my website. There are also on my website a number of lectures and articles written for the public and for scientists who are not neuroscientists, which are available there. And so by way of wrapping up, I just also want to thank my lab, who actually really does all the hard work, and you for your attention on this late afternoon on Wednesday. Thank you.
Really fascinating.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Barrett, for that fascinating talk. I think I'm going to sign up for the second part of it when you actually address the other points that you were suggesting, because that also sounds very interesting, how your deficit in your body, is related to a lot of the social phenomena that we see. But I think we have plenty of time for questions. So questions, comments?
Yes.
I'm wondering if there's a distinction between emotions that are the brain interpreting an involuntary sensation. So like after the fact, like I feel warm is good, I feel happy, versus the brain making a predictive concept about what sensations they expect to feel. Like I'm going to the beach, I know it will be warm, I feel happy.
There are some theorists who hypothesize that emotions only happen actually when there's an unexpected sensation. But really, I would say, no, there's no difference in process. There may be a difference in the intensity of the feeling, but there's really no difference in process. The real difference, I think, some things actually feel like, like a reflex. Right? And some things are a reflex. Some things, but reflexes are not these obligatory things that happen where you have no agency, actually. So it turns out even reflexes in an animal are context dependent and highly flexible. A reflex, though, is where your brain causes you to act in a way where it doesn't care about the prediction error, right? It's so serious. Your life is on the line. It doesn't care about learning from the situation. You just act. Whereas normally what would happen is your brain is preparing, and if there's prediction error there, if it senses something that isn't there, that didn't predict, it will adjust its prediction in order to make the action. And this is actually what happens, like in all sports, for example. Like there would be no ball sports if brains didn't predict, because your motor system can't actually mobilize an action fast enough to wait to see for a ball. But what's happening is, I know this is a heretical thing to say, but I know I live in Boston and I know the Red Sox are okay, but I used to think that baseball was really boring until I realized that actually it's a game of wits between a batter and a pitcher, right? The pitcher is predicting what the batter is going to do, knowing this batter, knowing the weather, knowing how heavy the bat is, knowing, actually his or her, but really it's, they're mostly him. at what conditions his body is in. And he's predicting. He's not necessarily doing it consciously. And the pitcher is trying to psych the batter out. And so all sports work like this, basically. But really, there's a lot of course correction going on under the hood, right? But sometimes not. And that's usually when we experience something really intensely, and we usually experience it as a reflex. Yeah.
I'm totally fascinated by all this. So I have like multiple questions.
Yeah.
How new is this research? And it would seem to me that if you were a therapist or psychiatrist, that you always hear the term like my patient is stuck, or I'm dealing with someone with PTSD.
Yeah.
It seems like that if you're a therapist or a counselor that's familiar with the science, you have tools to help that person get unstuck and deal with these different things.
So that's a complicated. So the question is, how new is this science? That's a hard question to answer. I would say, when we're talking about the first piece, all the stuff about emotion, I would say it's not new. In fact, when I was preparing to write my book, my editor wanted my book to be something that was like this. Once upon a time, we believed certain things to be true about emotion, but then modern science, modern neuroscience, modern psychology showed us that this wasn't true, and here's what we now know, the end. Unfortunately, that's actually not the story. The story is, no matter what counted as data at any era in science, there was always evidence that our beliefs about emotion weren't true. Always. Now, as new evidence, brain imaging was only invented in the 80s. As new evidence appears, it basically mirrors the old evidence, basically. The evidence about prediction, the evidence is new. The ideas are old. So these ideas go all the way back in psychology to Helmholtz in the 1800s. So it's a very old idea that, and actually it goes all the way back to, Kant. I mean, you could go, but the idea that the human mind is not reacting to things, but that we're using our past in order to create the present is a very old idea. That being said, the evidence on prediction is new. The anatomical evidence is probably about 30 or 40 years old. The electrical evidence, the electrical signaling evidence and how a brain works is maybe about the same. The brain imaging evidence is really new, but it's all really pointing to the same, conclusion. For mental illnesses, and I even hesitate to call them mental illnesses because there really is no difference between a mental illness and a physical illness. They're both biological illnesses. Even if you feel it mentally, it has a biological basis. Depression is a metabolic illness. Alzheimer's disease, metabolic illness. Heart disease, metabolic illness. You feel depressed, you feel mood disorder, you feel negative mood, and you have a mood disorder often in diseases that are thought to be physical. But when it comes to something like PTSD or depression, I think some of the treatments that are known actually take advantage of prediction without really realizing that they're doing it. What antidepressants do is they sort of change the conditions of your body budget, basically. Because it turns out that balancing your body budget when it's been in the red in a deficit for a long time is not as easy as making a single deposit like it is in your bank account. What I would say is that I think that I get emails on almost a daily basis from therapists asking me, where are the treatment plans based on this science? And the answer is, there aren't any. So it's new to them. It's new to the public. It's new to psychologists, I would say, right? This is all, what I showed you at the end there is really all neuroscience and electrical physiology work. It's not something even psychologists really know. And so I will say in the next 10 or 20 years, you'll see probably an explosion because it takes usually about 10 years, 10 to 20 years for knowledge in one science to percolate into another. But some of the treatments that we know about, exposure treatments, things like that, actually sort of take advantage of this without really realizing that's what they're doing it. But it could be more potent. It could be, there are other things that you can suggest to someone who's struggling based on this approach that they wouldn't normally do. Yeah.
Do you distinguish between emotions and feelings?
That's a really good question. Here's what I would say. Some people like to have that debate. Is an emotion an action? Is emotion a feeling? Here's what I would say. Your brain evolved to regulate your body. Your body has sensations that it gives, that it's sensory information that it gives to your brain. You are not wired to feel those directly. Because if you were, you'd never pay attention to anything outside your own skin ever again. Just think about the last time you had GI distress. Just think about the last time you had the flu. Do you care? You don't care what else is going on in the world. Philosophers call this tragic embodiment, right? You could be listening to something with rapt attention on the radio. You slice your finger with a knife. You don't care about anything. The little, cut on your finger has all of your attention. That's not a moral statement. That's just how it is. That's how you're wired. So instead, your brain, evolution has sort of given us a sort of shortcut to sense what's going on in our body budgets, which is affect or feeling. So we feel pleasant when everything is kind of copacetic with the body budget, and we feel like crap when we're running a deficit. We feel really worked up when there's prediction error and there's something new we got to learn or something uncertain, and we feel really calm when everything is running smoothly. And so affect, which that's what scientists call it. Some people call it mood or feeling. Affect is a consequence of your body budget. It's the way that it's what evolution has given you in place of, none of us have like a smartwatch to tell us exactly, how much glucose we have and whatever, right? So instead we're like, oh, I'm feeling kind of crappy right now. Maybe I should have something to eat or to drink. Or maybe I should have a rest. Or maybe I should get a hug, right? Or maybe I should go for a walk. And your brain is making sense out of that. And sometimes it's making sense out of that as an emotion, but also sometimes not. Sometimes as a perception or sometimes as a thought, right? When you're driving on the highway and somebody cuts you off and your reaction is, that guy's an asshole. There's a lot of affect in that. But it's a perception of that guy as in his assholeness, right? So affect is a property of consciousness. Feelings are a property of consciousness. Only some of those feelings are translated into an emotion in this culture. In other cultures, sometimes they're never translated into an emotion, right? So in our culture, if you lose a loved one, you are sad, you are grieving, you are bereft. There are other cultures where people aren't bereft, they're sick. They feel sick. They have a sickness. And to us, that sounds a little crazy. But actually, there isn't, from an affective perspective, not a lot of difference between feeling sick. Like the next time you get the flu, pay attention to your affect, right? There's not a lot of affective difference between having the flu and experiencing a loss. There are other differences, but not from an affective perspective.
Kind of going off on that, you said that the brain kind of takes in information as it is, and then
No, I never said it takes in information as it is.
And then it contextualizes it, right?
Well, it doesn't take in information. I don't know what you mean by as it is, but your brain is anticipating what the sensations are going to be, changing its own neurons, and then the information comes. And this is the part that I skipped over I can actually pull up the slides if you'd like, but so I appreciate you asking the question. And so the information comes in and then the brain compares. And if there's a match, then the information doesn't make it any further into the brain because it's already firing in a way that captures it, right? But if there's something there that's unexpected, or something that's expected that's not there, the brain has a choice. It can correct itself and learn that new information, or it can ignore that and go with its own prediction. And your brain does both of those things. And depending on how often it does one or the other, we would say that you are healthy or not well. Yeah. Yeah.
Might I ask which one of those decisions is more, or do we know which one of those decisions is more metabolically expensive?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are, in my lab, engaged in trying to answer that question right now. So we have a whole working group every week on the metabolics of the brain. There's, and the answer is probably it's more expensive to take in what we say encode, learn the unpredicted information. That's probably more expensive in the immediate. But whether it's more expensive in the long term is hard to say, because just as I said, you know, if your brain stands you up without raising your blood pressure and you fall and break something, that's also metabolically expensive. So part of what your brain is always doing is so one of the interesting things about all brains and human brains in particular is that it's not really making one prediction. It's making predictions actually on a timeline. Like there are a set of predictions that can be occurring across various timelines, whatever the trajectory of time that's relevant for the organism, right? So for bacteria, that's a couple of minutes. And for a rat, that might be a couple of days. And for a human, that's like your whole lifetime. So there's something in science called intertemporal choice, which is, do I spend a little bit now versus spending a lot later? What if I get a small reward now versus getting a large reward later? So it's trying to make a decision based on relative cost and relative reward. And so it's a hard question to answer. But strictly in terms of like the immediate metabolic costs, like glucose, it's probably most expensive to take in new information, change the firing of your neurons to incorporate that new information and then learn it or consolidate it, which involves, you know, growing new receptors and having your neurons change their connectivity a little bit, and which is expensive. In fact, your brain is actually the most expensive thing that you own. It's, 20% of your metabolic budget is devoted to your brain. And about 60 to 70% of that are your predictions. So your brain is not it has to try to be frugal, but it is, relatively speaking, the most expensive organ you own. So tell that to someone with a Tesla. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm curious. You're making this sound like it's a lot based on memory, right?
Not a lot based on memory.
Everything is.
Your memory is who you are.
And it's a constructed concept that's going on all the time.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, in the context of that, thinking of amnesia later in life,
yeah.
or of the growing process, from childhood, very
yes.
very early childhood towards
yes.
adulthood. How does that impact as memories are fewer, experiences are fewer, and then they're enriched? That should change how the reactions, take place.
Well, yes. So either one. Pick which one you'd like me to talk about first.
I'm just thinking of one instance. If amnesia occurs, let's say, midway through life, or the HM case where learning new experiences becomes very difficult after.
Well, it doesn't become difficult. It became impossible.
Impossible, right?
Right.
Right. Would you then assess that basically, if you don't have the exposure to new instances, would the emotional experience be altered to a certain instance?
Well, HM had, you know, I can't remember exactly how old he was, in his mid-30s, right, when he had his surgery, I think, right, or maybe in his 20s, but I thought it was maybe his early 30s. Anyways, he had at least 20 years of experience already to draw from, and so his emotional his emotional experiences were altered, but not he still had a full range of experiences that his brain could make. He just didn't learn anything new ever, right? It just wasn't possible. And what you're asking me is about, I think, something that scientists don't completely still understand. I mean, HM was a patient who people thought he had a very specific lesion to his hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that's important for making memory. But it turns out he didn't only have lesions in hippocampus. He had other parts of his brain were lesioned also. And so, and exactly how the hippocampus works in prediction is an active area of research right now. But I think a better example than HM is actually Alzheimer's or any kind of dementia, where people are slowly losing the capacity to make predictions, basically. They're slowly losing the capacity to remember. What it means to remember is not to retrieve a memory. It means to remake an experience that your brain made once before, that it learned once before. And what happens in Alzheimer's disease is that you're slowly losing the capacity to do that. Now, one thing that we didn't talk about here, because there wasn't really time, is in the brain, predictions have to start somewhere. Where do they start? Well, it turns out they start in the parts of the brain that regulate your body, which are the parts of the brain that people used to talk about as emotional parts. But they're not emotional parts. They're the parts that regulate your body. They do many other things too, but while they're doing those other things, they're also regulating your body. And where does disease begin in Alzheimer's disease? In those regions. That's where you see plaques and tangles, beta amyloid plaques and tangles. So, because Alzheimer's disease is also a metabolic illness. If you are metabolically encumbered for a very, very long time, eventually, what will your brain do? It will attempt to reduce its costs. Neurons are expensive little buggers to keep alive. One way to reduce your costs is to kill some of your neurons. You actually have cells in your brain that do that. They're called glial cells. In fact, I'm always forgetting. Astrocytes. No, microglia. There are 3 kinds. One of them are the little cleaners of the nervous system. I think it's microglia, actually, that are the neuron killers. And then there's another kind that keeps the axons healthy, oligodendrocytes, and so. But the point is that psychologists who write about Alzheimer's disease talk about losing the capacity losing losing your sense of self when you lose your memory. But you don't just in the late stages of Alzheimer's, you lose the capacity to regulate your body completely. You forget what basic things that you learned when you were an infant, like how to open a door, what a chair is, how to use a fork. Now, at the other end of at the beginning of life, an infant, a newborn, is born mostly without predictions. So I say mostly because, first of all, the brain is not fully formed in an infant, right? So little human brains are not like miniature adult brains. They are brains that are waiting for a set of wiring instructions from the world so they can finish wiring themselves across a 25-year period. This is a special human adaptation. Our brains grow for longer and take much longer to develop. And part of what's happening is that they're learning. So for an infant, it's like mostly prediction error most of the time. An infant can't regulate its own body budget. It doesn't have the wiring to do that. You have to do it as the caregiver. You basically are maintaining that child's body budget. And you maintain that child's body budget by feeding it and regulating its temperature and teaching it when to go to sleep and teaching it how to eat. Babies aren't born knowing when to go to sleep and when not to. They have to be taught that. They don't even know how to nurse. They actually have to be taught that, trust me. Every woman who's ever nursed an infant knows exactly what I'm talking about. They have to be taught all kinds of things. Just like other animals, little baby animals have to be taught things too. What does it mean to learn? It means that there are no predictions. It's all prediction error all the time. Alison Gopnik, the developmental psychologist, talks about there being a lantern of attention, as opposed to adults who have a spotlight of attention. Babies have a lantern. They don't know what's important. They don't know what's not important. They would take in everything. But you know what? Taking in everything, learning everything, that's metabolically expensive. You can't learn everything. Your spotlight of attention is your brain's way of figuring out what you need to pay attention to learn it and what you can safely ignore. A baby doesn't know. So how does it figure it out? It figures it out because you teach it. You don't realize that's what you're doing, but that's what you're doing. When you make eye contact with a baby and then you look at something, they look at it, right? We do that with each other with gaze. If we were in a place where, if I'd never been here before, if I wasn't from this country, and we were talking and there was a siren outside, if you look towards the siren, I would look towards the siren. If you ignore the siren, I'll ignore the siren. Because I'm looking to you for a cue. We regulate each other's body budgets all the time, but we regulate infants' body budgets particularly. And we don't just do it with, feeding and clothing and whatever. We also do it with social cues. We do it by talking to them. We do it with eye contact. We do it with touch. And it turns out if you don't do those things, the brain does not develop normally. You can feed an infant. You can keep it warm. You can make sure it has bed to sleep in. If you do not give it the social contact that it expects, that the brain expects, the brain will not develop normally, which we know. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, we know this to be true, unfortunately, because there were sort of natural experiments done for us in Romanian orphanages. And so we can see the effects of children who are not overtly abused, who are neglected socially, but who are fed, who are clothed, who have a place to sleep, but they don't have normal human contact, which is required. And why is it required? Because that's where your predictions come from. So a human brain wires itself to its social and its physical surroundings, which is how a single human brain, the single structure of the sort of general blueprint can make many kinds of human minds, depending on what culture is it bathed in, that it basically bootstraps into its own brain through learning. And the vehicle for that learning is the care of that child's body budget, basically.
I just want to say that your contributions are just so remarkable. And I teach here as well in behavior science for the College of Professional Studies. And so we've been really looking at your work very closely in various leadership and psychology courses. And I think one of the pressing questions that often comes up is just, again, in terms of application, like how do we help deprogram ourselves through, really tough constructions that we've inherited? So do you have any ideas about that? And I also want to acknowledge too, I think I've been in the mental health field for 20 years. I've been teaching for 10 years. And this is just such a healthy disruption that you provide for all of us. So I want to thank you for that.
Thanks, thank you.
I've been talking a lot about appraisals in my work, and it's it's so great that you're bringing us up to speed in the ways that you are.
Thanks,
really
thanks.
And helpful.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate that. So I would say now we're about to go into the land of speculation, right? Because a lot of what I'm about to say has not been tested and validated. Mm-hmm. But I think that so it's really, I would say, instead of coming from the context of justification, where we've done controlled clinical trials and we know this works, this is now coming from, I would say, reasoned speculation based on what I understand to be true, and also what I do in my own life and with my own kids and what I tell my friends to do. So there's that for whatever it's worth. Some of it sounds, I don't know, maybe not so crazy anymore, but initially sounded crazy. Like, well, sleep more. You know, get a lot of exercise. I mean, get enough exercise. Eat properly. I mean, these things sound kind of nuts, but actually, they make it easier to keep your body budget solvent if you do those things. Like so people will say to me, well, if there was only one thing I could do, what should I do? I'd be like, get a good night's sleep. Now,
it's like preserve the metabolic and stop like going into this deep analysis of your thoughts. And
oh yeah, right.
that.
And also thoughts don't drive feelings. Okay, feelings drive thoughts. Feelings drive thoughts because your body budget is the center of literally the center of your brain. The parts that regulate your body budget are literally at the center of your brain, and they drive everything else. And this has been known for like 30 years. They also happen to be really, crucial for memory, and they're crucial for attention, and they're multi-purpose in a sense. I'm from a psychological, but there are other things that you can do. So, for example, you can change your context, like literally physically move somewhere else. I mean, get up and take a walk, move to a different spot, stand up instead of sitting down. Why do I say this? I say this because remember that what's driving your predictions is the moment before. Right? So what I experience right now is somehow constrained by what just happened an instant ago. And the context that you're in is really driving your predictions as much as your internal state is driving those predictions for whatever the next moment will be. So you can change your environment, go out for a walk, clear your, what does that mean? It means to clear your head, like literally it clears your head. But if you can't do that, you can also like figuratively change your environment, which is what mindfulness is. Mindfulness works because you're focusing on details that you were otherwise were noise, and now they're signal. Remember how I said you can't pay attention to everything. Your brain can't be concerned with everything. It's too expensive. So it makes choices. But you can learn to change those choices. You can learn to pay attention. So one of the things, for example, that helped me a lot, which I know will sound crazy, and it also helps people who I know personally who have who suffer from depression, who struggle with depression, is being mindful of things that you normally would just ignore completely, like a weed popping through the crack of a sidewalk. Who pays attention to that? And from an aesthetic standpoint, it might kind of not even be very pretty. It's not a flower, although flowers and weeds also social reality. But anyways, but you can be mindful of it, and in that moment, you can be appreciating the power of nature. That no matter what we do, nature just will not be deterred, right? So much so that it can force a crack in a sidewalk. Right? Or like a tree, like sometimes you see those like, roots of trees that just demolish a sidewalk, those are golden moments, opportunities for mindfulness. And in that instant, it's like a mental readjustment because for a minute, you're a speck. And nature is looming large. You can have wonder or awe. And if you're a speck, your problems are a speck. And that gives your body a break for a second. And that may not sound like a really important thing, but I think that's actually a really powerful thing. And I would say when you practice making experiences for yourself in an effortful way, this is an effortful thing, but if you practice it, it becomes automatic, like driving. Eventually it becomes a habit. And that's really what predictions are. They're like mental habits. So if you ruminate, if you allow your body to drive your thoughts down a really negative path, you are just digging you're basically solidifying those habits and you're digging that path really deep. But if you stop yourself, which is effortful and hard, and sometimes we can't, but we have to try, and we direct our attention elsewhere, then we can practice making experiences for ourselves that are deliberate and effortful, but that with practice, they become much more automatic. So I have to tell you, I initially, when my colleagues started to do research on gratitude and compassion and awe, my reaction was, initially my thought was, this is just such bullshit. You know, like, I'm sorry, I grew up Jewish. There's no value to, that was a joke. You guys have to, maybe you don't know Jewish culture, but there's no, like when people ask me, well, what about, what about, teaching children? I'm like, I grew up in a very Jewish home. So there was no place for positivity. That's not how things work. But I was very persuaded by the data, which show that it helps. Keeping a positivity journal really helps. Even more than a positivity journal, a pleasure journal. I don't mean sexual pleasure necessarily, although that could work too, but actually learning to experience pleasure in small things is actually really important. And it's something that's really overlooked, savoring small pleasures. So in depression and anxiety and, in many difficulties that people have challenged with, they lose the capacity to feel pleasure at small things, which is anhedonia. That's the name, right? But it's hugely important for your body budget to feel pleasure at small things. And so teaching yourself to do that by keeping a journal or what have you actually really works. And I just got really fascinated. Like my colleague Dave DeSteno has this fantastic research that he does. And I thought, well, okay, it's really important to understand why this is working this way. So do we know for sure it's because we're rewiring our brains to predict differently? I don't think we know that for sure, but I think it's a reasonable guess at this point. And I think it's a sufficiently reasonable guess that I myself do it. I have my kid do it. I have my goddaughter do it. I basically, anybody who is willing to listen to me, thank you for giving me the opportunity, I suggest that they give it a try because it's not going to hurt. And frankly, people need some new ideas. So that's, in my book, I talk a lot about being an architect of your life, of your experience. And this is exactly the kind of thing that I mean. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being so generous with your time.
Sure,
and
my
so
pleasure.
Inspiring and even, I think we crossed at some point from the scientific to the poetic to the practical and thereabouts. So thank you so very much.
Oh yeah, it's my pleasure.
It's
My
been a
pleasure.
pleasure.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.